So the water utility is a little bit different than our other utilities, the electric and the wastewater utility, in that it only serves within the city limits of Lake Mills. The other two actually serve outside of the city. So this one, if they're residents and taxpayers, they're also ratepayers to the water utility, just a little bit different. So this is our system map, and this is our current staff right now. Priorities, these are pretty classic. I mean, customer service, we try to make our number one priority. Then safe water, and we'll talk about that, and complying with all the regulations that we have to, that we have a sufficient supply, and at this point we do, and that our rates are both affordable so that the community can afford it, but they're also adequate so that we can maintain our system properly. So there you see we have about 41 miles of water main that we take care of, and then a little over 2,600 utility service lines. Now, the difference between a main line, the main is the big line that runs down the street, and the service lines are the ones that move into the houses. Quick snapshot of our income and expense, and you'll notice that in 2021, our net operating income was pretty healthy, $628,000. But then you'll also notice that in 2020 it was a negative 23, and then 19 it was $250,000, then 18 it was minus 72,000. What happens is that we try to use cash as much as we can to pay for projects. And so what those years are reflecting, for example, all the work that we did on Main Street. And so those were extra costs that we had. When we painted the water tower in 2018, that's why our revenue, or our net operating income was so low. So it'll fluctuate, because by using cash, we can keep our rates down a little bit. And so we try to do that as much as possible. I also want to mention something called the pilot, or the payment in lieu of taxes. This is because as a nonprofit organization, the utility doesn't necessarily pay property tax. So instead, the Public Service Commission has a calculation that allows the utility to pay tax dollars to the city, and those are the last 5 years of those payments. I will note that the electric utility does the same thing, and the electric utility payments are a little bit higher. That in essence makes the two utilities one of the largest property taxpayers in the city. All right, more stats. We have about 3,200 total customers. In 21, we pumped 172 million gallons of water, and of those we sold 140 million. I will talk about that a little more. You'll notice those numbers don't jibe up, because that's what we have, what we call water loss. And that is simply water that is lost in the system, inaccuracy of meters, et cetera, et cetera. The PSC and the DNR accept that 15% water loss is acceptable. So it's a very common thing that not all the water that's pumped is actually billed. Now, you will notice on this graph, and I'm looking at the dark purple line on top, we had some issues back a few years ago where our water loss was getting up in the 30% range. And so we made a concerted effort to get that down. And we did that by looking more closely for leaks. We did a leak study, and we found a number of those. And it was a combination of small leaks, not big ones that would appear in the street or something like that, but small leaks. And, as you may be aware, we went to an AMI meter reading system, which is a much more sophisticated, much more accurate meter reading system. And we were able to recoup and find some loss because meters were not registering accurately. So right now we're down to about 16%, and we're continuing to work to get that even lower. We talk a lot about how old our system is and how the mains are aging, and we have to maintain our infrastructure. Pipe can last a long time, as you'll see in the next slide. But right now, we know that about 40% of our main lines are more than 50 years old, which means, to a certain extent, they're coming to the end of their life. And so we either have to start replacing mains, or understand that we'll have to be doing something with them. There's a lot of technology now for fixing the mains from the inside, not necessarily after replacing them or have to replace them. There's liners, et cetera, et cetera. But the point of this slide is that it's not uncommon for communities to let their mains go. Out of sight, out of mind kind of thing. But we can't allow that to continue to happen. The photo you see kind of in the middle, that's what a new pipe looks like when it goes in, and the one below it is what a pipe looks like when it's kind of lived its life. The other point I'll make here is that we are now looking more and more at going away from metal, if you will, or cast iron pipe to plastic, or PVC, if you will. Just a little bit of context. This is from a report that the Utah State University does. Small versus large utilities. Typically, small utilities have twice as many main breaks as the large ones, and that's usually due to finances, that the small ones don't have as much capital to use to replace pipe before it breaks. Corrosion is the biggest deal, and we'll talk again more about that. There you see that the average age of the failing mains is 50 years. And so when we've got a large group of our water mains that are 50 years old, we know they're going to start failing. Now, the contrast to that is the national rate of replacement is about 125 years. So you can see there's a contradiction there that we have to take care of. The average repair cost of a water main break is about $5,000. The average cost to repair or to replace a water line before it breaks is much lower than that. And so our goal is to not have a length of pipe that's nothing but repairs at $5,000 a foot, give or take, where if we replace them, we can do it much cheaper. We are under the regulation of 3 different entities, and this goes to the water quality that, you know, the EPA, the Public Service Commission, and the DNR all watch us very closely. They all have very stringent rules for the quality of our water. The PSC really oversees more of the cost, while the EPA and the DNR really are the water quality regulators. Our operator requirements are quite stringent. We have to have a certified operator based on administrative code. We are working toward having all of both of our younger operators get their certification, and then operators have to renew their certification on a regular basis and take continuing education. I just wanted to note that we do have also very stringent and lengthy water testing requirements. I believe there's 3 to 4 pages of water tests that we have to perform every day. And when I say every day, that's 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So even on weekends and holidays, someone has to go out and take water samples and make sure that even on those days, our water is meeting the grade. I mentioned the Consumer Confidence Report. This is something that is required by the EPA that we have to do annually, and it lists all the detected contaminants. Now that's a key phrase there. We test for a number of contaminants. Only the ones that are detected, or the ones that show up as existing in our water system, are listed in the CCR, in the Consumer Confidence Report. So if they're not listed there, that means that there was either no detection or it was so far below the minimum contamination level that it's insignificant. So I'm going to get into some specifics now from last year's report. And again, I will show you everything that showed a detection level in the report. If it wasn't in the report, there was no detection level shown, and so it's just not significant at this time. Chlorine residuals. Now, we do add chlorine to the water for sanitation, but we also have to test to see how much of that chlorine remains in the system, for 2 reasons. One is to make sure that it's going throughout the system, and secondly, to make sure that it's not at a level that's too high. So you can see that both chlorine types, the HAAS and the TTHM, are very low compared to the MCL, but they're high enough that we know that they're getting through the entire system. All right, radioactive contaminants. This one's a little bit different story. Now, there's 2 tests that we do. One is for radium-226 and 228, and then one is for the combined radium. And I'll talk about the combined radium first. That's the orangish line, the real small line, very low compared to the MCL. Now, the radium-226 and 228, a little different story. As you can see there, our levels went up and to the point where they reached 5.5 million parts per liter. And what the DNR does with this one is they have a rolling average. In other words, they take 4 quarters tests, 4 tests a year, and average them and come up with the MCL. We exceeded that, as you can see, back a couple years ago, so that the max was 5 parts. We were at 5.5 parts on this rolling average in one well. And so what we did is a lot of research on this particular well. It was well number 4. and found that most of the radium leakage, if you will, or seepage, was coming from the bottom 100 feet of the well. So we abandoned that. We sealed it. And you see now that our MCL is coming down steadily. So we were able to mitigate the source of the radium, and we continue to monitor that very closely. The other two wells, 5 and 6, we have not seen any issue at all. All right, barium, another one that shows up. Again, we are well below the MCL, but it's something that has shown up in our reports. And I think this is the last one, fluoride. Again, fluoride is something we put in the water. It's for dental reasons. We do test again, just like with the chlorine. We want to make sure it's getting through the system, but we don't want to get it through the system in such a level that it becomes dangerous. Once again, we are well below the MCL with fluoride. Nickel also, it was detected, but at a very low range. Arsenic is something we have to test for every year. It wasn't something we always had to do. So it's always going to be in our CCR. 0 was detected, and so that's a good thing. And then nitrates is something that, again, we test for, but the last time we had any kind of detection was in 2016. So the fact that it's not in the CCR in 17, 18, 19, 20 is simply because the level was so low that it wasn't detected. What all of that says is that our water system is very safe. It meets all the regulations. In fact, it exceeds many of the regulations. And the amount of testing that we have to do and that other communities have to do ensures that the water system is safe. Lead and copper. So the first rules really came out in 1991, and then it wasn't until 2014 when an issue occurred in Flint, where lead in the water was extremely high, dangerously high. And I want to make sure everybody understands that we're not Flint. The water that we provide is not full of lead. The lead comes from the service lines that go from the main line into the home. And so it's a very individual situation. And that's why the DNR and the EPA are requiring that people remove lead service lines. We were required, starting back in 2017, to do some extensive testing. We were doing 40 tests a year, or 40 tests twice a year at homes that were selected by the DNR because they were known to have had lead water pipes. And the tests came back high, and some incredibly high, and we were having all kinds of trouble trying to figure out what's going on here. And what we learned was that when the water goes through the pipes, at times it actually breaks off little pieces of lead. And so we would get a test one month that was incredibly high, and the next month it was nothing, and that was simply because little pieces of lead were breaking off getting into the test kit. Regardless, the DNR worked with us very closely to do some really good testing, do some other things with our corrosion control, because that's a big deal, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but to just really get a handle on how much lead was turning up in these samples. And I will tell you again, now, it's not that there's lead in the water, it's just that there are lead service lines, and they were very predictable in where they were going to be located. They were in the older parts of town. And it was very predictable that at a house where there were more people, and typically younger people where they ran more water, the tests were low. In homes where there were, say, fewer people and elderly people where they didn't run as much water, the tests were high. Because what happens is the water sits in the pipe and then the lead leaches into it. So it became very predictable and very clear what we had going on. So we have now worked through this to the point where we've replaced a number of lead service lines. And at one point, actually we're still in the point where we now no longer have to test for lead, that our concentration levels went down so low that although we have to continue replacing lead service lines, we don't have to test for lead anymore. Now, the DNR has what they call consent orders. And these are not anything that you want to deal with, okay? But we got nicked with a few, and understandably so. When we had our lead sampling was too high, we had the radium level that was too high. And so what happens is the DNR puts together a consent order, and what that does is outlines very clearly what we have to do. And there's no getting around it. It's It's an edict. I will tell you that we have been able to successfully work through all of the consent orders. We don't have any more hanging over us right now, and in fact, like I mentioned, in regard to the inventory and some of our tactics, if you will, techniques for replacing lead service lines, we're a leader. So we did this citywide LSL inventory. We are able to reduce the sampling requirement. It's gone. So far, out of approximately 300 plus lead service lines, we replaced 178 on the resident side and 173 on the utility side. Understand what that means is that from the main line to a valve the city owns, and then from that valve into the house is what the resident owns. So we've replaced the entire length of some of these. Extensive education on what lead means in the drinking water, what can be done. We've given out a number of filters so that people can feel comfortable drinking their water because it's gone through a lead-specific filter, that sort of thing. We are in the process now of adjusting our corrosion control, and what this means is that we put a product into the water in very, very small amounts that literally coat the pipes, and the idea of coating the pipes is to prevent the lead from leaching into the pipes. And so we worked with the DNR. We set up a test at one of our wells. It literally mimicked a house, or actually 4 houses, and we tested 4 different products to see which one was the most effective. And after 18 months of doing that, we found the product that works best in our system, and now we'll be implementing that. We have to have that done by the end of this year, and we're going to be ahead of that goal also. I just want to give you some real quick rate comparisons here in all of Wisconsin for all the water utilities. The range for 300 gallons a month is anywhere from $152 to $17. The average rate, as you see, is $44 per month, and we're at about $48, $49 per month. We're close. We don't anticipate, and I'm never going to say never, a rate increase for a while, but we do know that some of the other cities that are sitting in the average rate class there have not started an LSL program, and so they're going to have costs, have not started a corrosion control program, so they're going to have costs, their rates are going to go up. So if we can hold steady, we're going to hang around the average rate. We just want to always give a caveat to the rate comparisons. This is kind of what I was just mentioning. This information comes from the PSC annual report. We're pretty fastidious about how we put our report together. I should say Dwayne is very fastidious about how that goes. We know that some other cities are not, and I won't kick anybody around, but they are not. Utility characteristics are vastly different, water supplies, size, that sort of thing. We put in here, we're not eligible for grants because our median household income is too high. So we have a little trouble getting grants to do a lot of repairs. So like I say, it's got to come out of cash. And then as I mentioned, a lot of the other communities are going to start doing some of the projects that we've been doing right along. Rate drivers, our replacement program, we've been pretty aggressive the last few years. We'll see how it goes with budgets. We hope to keep doing that, but again, budgets will dictate that. These 2 things are going to keep coming at us, the replacement and the corrosion control, so we've got to keep at it. So we are getting funding to do that, but physically we can't do that many in a year, so we've probably got about 2-3 years left on the LSL replacement. Like I mentioned, the corrosion control, that'll be in place yet this year. Okay, a couple of specifics. Brown water, not uncommon, ugly stuff, it's unpleasant. But it is safe. Basically what it is sediment from the pipes. If you remember the slide I showed you earlier, you go from the newer pipe to the older pipe, they rust. And what happens is that any disturbance, any significant disturbance in the system will break loose some of this iron and manganese. It could be a water main break. It could be, for example, shutting a fire hydrant too fast or opening it too fast. It knocks the system. You know, in your house, if you sometimes turn off a faucet too hard, you get that hammering noise or something like that, especially in older homes. That's what happens in our system. Every year we do hydrant flushing as is required, and that disturbance will cause brown water. It's ugly, and you certainly don't want to bathe in it, and I would discourage anyone from washing their whites in it. But it usually will clear up in a couple of days. And so what we do is ask people to just run the water for a little longer, flush that out of the system. If it lasts too long, then we ask people to give us a call and we'll look to see if something else is happening. So brown water and the water smells like chlorine are the two biggest complaints, if you will, that we get from folks. Again, the chlorine is added for sanitation. People are not actually smelling chlorine. I know this is splitting hairs. They're smelling the chloramines, which is the chlorine is working. That's the breakdown of the chlorine, and actually that's what you smell in a swimming pool is the chlorine breaking down and doing its job. You may smell this if, for whatever reason, we've got a higher level of algae or something in the water. That doesn't happen very often, but it may, or if you're near a dead-end line. And what happens in the dead-end lines, as you see there, the water becomes stagnant. And when that happens, the chlorine works very hard to try to keep that clean. And so that may cause it. Every once in a while, although it's highly regulated, we may over-chlorinate, maybe because of a malfunction or something like that. And so if the water does smell like chlorine, we ask people to call us immediately. Some of the regulations for the future, of course, we talked about lead, PFAS. This one's been in the news a lot. It's going to be in the news a lot. We did a test, we did a voluntary test for PFAS, and at all 3 wells, the tests came back lower than the tests were able to detect. In other words, according to the DNR's letter, we do not have PFAS in the city. Now, just read today that the EPA has put out standards saying that some of the PFAS, if they have levels of 0.004 parts per trillion, that is too high. The interesting part about that is right now we don't have a test that can detect at that low level. Again, this is something that's going to continue to be looked at. What they've done is they've made a health advisory, which is not meaning that anybody has to do anything. It's just be aware that a rule is being worked on in regard to PFAS, and where that'll go, we don't know. But it'll be a topic for quite some time. Future issues will be what happens on the south side if that continues to grow. That's a little far from our water tower, and we want to make sure we have adequate pressure out there. If something happens on the north side of the interstate, that's going to require considerable adding to our infrastructure, water tower, things like that. As I mentioned, our facilities are getting old. We've got to stay on top of those. We are looking at, and the PSC is looking at, some sort of new rate structure and funding methods for utilities so that we can maintain an affordability, that we can ensure that the entire community can afford water. It's far too important to price it out of affordability, so we're paying close attention to that. Always new regulations coming up. And staffing, I think right now we're in pretty good shape, but overall staffing in all of the department, staffing is an issue. And our future goals, of course, are to keep the water safe and clean, keep it affordable, get our LSL replacements done, and continue our system upgrades.